Hi, I'm Dr. David Perl, the Quit Limerence Doctor. I wanted to talk today a little bit about transgenerational trauma, or sometimes known as intergenerational trauma. When I trained as a psychotherapist and counsellor, we didn't really touch upon this whole issue of how trauma, psychological and emotional trauma, is passed down the line from parent to child. And I want to talk about my own personal experience. So this is not so much a teaching or educational video. It's more just about my own thoughts and feelings around transgenerational trauma and the impact of it. So growing up, the elephant in the room, or what is often known as the conspiracy of silence, was the fact that my father was a Holocaust survivor. That he had been in Auschwitz as a 13-year-old boy, 12, 13 years old. And in that time, both his mother and father and 7 brothers and sisters were murdered, were gassed by the Nazis. When I entered therapy many years ago, I remember in the first session, when I was giving my history to my therapist, that, oh, and by the way, my father is a Holocaust survivor, but that hasn't had any impact on me. I hadn't gone through that experience and therefore it didn't affect me. That was a long time ago, and over the years I've realized that actually his experience has become my trauma. And let me tell you a story that goes right back to just the power of this trauma. I mean, certainly growing up, I was always self-conscious about being Jewish. I would never mention it to anybody. I would keep my head down under the parapet, because one of the beliefs that I grew up with was that if people knew that you were a Jew, you were going to get murdered, you were going to get shot, you were going to get put in the gas chamber. This was never spoken out loud, it was never said, but it was like an unconscious script that I just grew up with in my family of origin. Now, many years ago, I was working as a repatriation physician. I was doing my dream job. I was flying around the world on air ambulances, in business class, first class. I traveled to about 70 countries to bring back sick passengers on behalf of their travel insurance companies. And there was one trip I did, I think it was to Spain, in a private air ambulance, and we flew the patient back somewhere up north in England, and we didn't have time to get back home, back down south, so we stayed the night at a hotel. And as is common in these events, we went out for a meal, we went out for a curry, the 2 pilots, myself and the nurse. And over supper, we were just bantering, and then one of the pilots told a joke, and the joke went something like this: that there was an aircraft at Heathrow waiting to take off, and it was a British Airways aircraft, and they were listening on the radio, and over the radio came a Lufthansa pilot saying that they were missing one passenger, and they couldn't find them. And the British Airways pilot came over the radio and said, "Check your ovens, he may be in there." Obviously making a reference to the crematoria where the Nazis, where the Germans would burn the bodies after they gassed them. Now in that moment, I just felt a little bit uncomfortable, but nothing more than that. It's interesting, as I'm telling this story, I'm starting to feel some of the same feelings. But after about 10 or 15 minutes, I started to feel sick. And I thought, oh, there's something wrong with this curry. It doesn't taste too good. It tasted fine, but I was starting to feel sick. And then I just had to get up and I had to rush up the stairs to the toilet. I remember the toilets in this curry house were upstairs. And halfway up the stairs, I just vomited. I just threw up. It just came up. There was no holding it back. And I compartmentalized that experience. I'd never really thought about it much until many, many years later in my own therapy. And now I know that that was a bodily reaction to my trauma. And it's interesting because I say my trauma because it wasn't my trauma. I hadn't lived through that experience. My father had. Roll forward many years. And whilst in therapy, I started to explore this a little bit deeper. My therapist encouraged me to start reading about the Holocaust, watching videos about it, and to just so that we could start unpacking some of this trauma that I held. And one of the things I knew was that at some point in my life, I was always going to have to go to Auschwitz and visit it. However, this was such a demon that I thought there's no way I'm ever going to be able to find the courage or strength within me to do that. And then about 6-7 years ago, my father, who's still alive, was invited to go as part of a group called March of the Living. And they also said that he can take a carer with him or somebody to help him, and he asked if I would go. And I thought, wow, this is such an amazing opportunity to not only go, I want to say go back to Auschwitz, and but to go to Auschwitz with him. And whenever I told anybody of this journey that we were going to make, I said to them, I'm going back to Auschwitz with my father. And yet the curious thing is, I'd never been to Auschwitz before. And yet I felt compelled to say, I'm going back to Auschwitz. It was as if I'd actually been there before and had this lived experience, even though I hadn't. It was a really powerful experience. And I've made a longer video of that, if anybody wants to while away an hour of their life in watching that whole experience. I may edit it down to something more manageable, just some snippets of the key moments of that journey. But it was an incredibly profound and cathartic journey for me. But it also gave me an opportunity of just seeing how shut down emotionally my father had become. And I suppose it was the only way that he could survive enduring such absolute horrors. And I remember one moment when we were walking around the camp, what was called the Auschwitz-Birkenau. Birkenau were the actual camps where the men where the people, not just the men, were segregated into these long barracks, prison barracks basically. And we were walking around and Dad stopped and he recognized one of the barracks that he'd been in, or it looked very similar to one of the barracks he'd been in, and he stopped and I could see that he was starting to get emotional. And I put my arm around him and I said, you know, Dad, you don't have to keep this pain in, you can let it out. You don't have to keep pushing down your sadness, all your other feelings. And he said to me, he said, no, if I show any weakness, the Nazis will know that they've beaten me. And I tried to explain to him that crying and grieving over his family doesn't mean that he's weak. It's just a natural part of being human. But he couldn't find it in him to do that. What has been my experience is that trauma has been passed down to me and my 3 sisters. And then the burden is put on our shoulders to do that grief work if we're up for it. And whilst therapy was a great crucible or container for me to deal with some of those feelings, the more profound and deeper and more cathartic healing, and far more painful as well, has been through the men's work. It was finding a community of men that I could feel, that I could trust and be safe with, that could literally hold me and support me as I sunk into that well of grief and touched my own anger and sadness. And on that journey, I actually went to staff at a Mankind Project weekend. This community of men is the Mankind Project. I'll put a link at the bottom of this article, because if there's any men out there, I can't recommend the support and growth that I've got through the Mankind Project more highly. Well, I went as a staff man to Germany because I wanted to go and express how I felt about what these bastards had done to my family. I mean, I was raised never to trust Germans. The German language to me just put the hairs on the back of my neck up. We never had German cars. Nothing in the house could be made in Germany. And so I grew up with this message not to trust Germans, to hate them. And so I went over to Germany believing that I was going to have to try and work through some of these beliefs, because they're just beliefs and they weren't even my beliefs. They were my father's beliefs of expunging some of this stuff that I was still holding within. And what was extraordinary was that when I arrived in Germany, I met up with a group of about 40 German men who expressed nothing but love for me. They didn't know my story, but they just were there to be there as part of a team. And I just felt accepted and approved. And I love their sense of humour. In the UK, we're taught that the Germans don't have a sense of humour, but I learned that they do. And then on Sunday morning, we had time to actually, as a group of staff men, these 40 men, we had an opportunity. We circled up, as we often did, to just talk and get up and do whatever it is that we need to do if we're looking for something from the group. And so I felt compelled to get up, and I stood in the circle of 40 German men. And I told them about how I was raised to hate Germans, and how this burden was still with me, and I wanted to release it, and that was part of the reason why I'd come over to Germany. And I told them my story of my father, who was in Auschwitz and then on the death marches, and eventually was liberated from Dachau. And the irony was that this staffing was very near to Munich in Germany, and Dachau is very near to Munich as well. And when I told my story, men just broke down and cried. I was crying in the middle. And I said that I wanted to come out and do what we call a clearing, to actually work through some of these emotions that I'd pushed down into my shadow. And what I felt compelled to do was to bless these men, to bless them for the love and support and kindness they were showing me. And what I learned was, and also with other men that I've met, other German men that I've met through the Mankind Project, two of whom were children. One was the grandchild of a Nazi, and one was a relative of somebody in the Gestapo, that they carried probably more pain than I did. They carried so much guilt around what had happened. And men came up to me afterwards and said that was one of the most profound moments they've been part of, that whole process of just expressing deep held anger and rage and sadness. So my views on transgenerational trauma have changed significantly. I realized that so much of what we hold, and this is just one example of one significant trauma, but so much of what we hold is held within us almost at a body level. Another example that maybe or maybe not relates to this is that a number of the clients that I work with are men who've been sexually abused as children. And in the work that I do, I can be quite empathetic. I'm a bit of an empath, and I'll pick up on other people's feelings. And sometimes if a story is sad or it's touching something in me, I'll well up a little bit. But when I'm working with a client who's been sexually abused, I notice that this feeling is way more intense. And a client that I'm working with asked me to watch a video on a website called 1 in 6, because 1 in 6 men have been sexually abused. It's a 4-minute video, and I'm going to put the link to it at the bottom, because it's such a profound video. And I sat there with my client, and I was just bawling my eyes out. I couldn't stop crying. And I know this is touching something deep in me, but I don't think I've been sexually abused. But what I do know is, and again, I've only seen this written once, is that in Auschwitz, when the young boys would arrive, it was a prison camp. The men and women were segregated. It wasn't uncommon for the young boys to be raped. And when I volunteered for a year at the Holocaust Survivor Centre in London, one of the survivors had written a book, and he talks about how the first night he arrived at Auschwitz as a young boy, he was raped. And what I do know is that when boys are sexually abused, it fucks them up. It messes them up completely. They find it hard to hold down relationships. It messes their sexuality. It messes up their sexuality. And I can't help but wonder, did something happen to my father? Or maybe to his father? I don't know. But it feels like there's something that I'm carrying in my genes around this trauma. I've asked my father, I said to him, because we now have a relationship where I'm completely honest with him. I said to him, were you raped when you were at Auschwitz? Did anything happen to you where you were sexually abused? And he said, no, nothing like that at all, never. But what I do know is that so many men feel so much huge shame around that they never disclose such trauma. Now, maybe it's just I'm very empathetic and caring, and that's such an abusive trauma for a child. I pick up on that, but this just to me feels something much deeper. So it makes me wonder, how much of the trauma do we carry of our parents? Because if they don't work through their stuff in their lifetime, it's like we absorb it by osmosis. It doesn't have to be spoken about. We unconsciously pick it up. And so much of the work that I do is around affair recovery and limerence. And what I do know is that quite often somebody who's had an affair or is in limerence, they're replaying something from their familial line. That quite often a parent may have had an affair. And sometimes this isn't disclosed. And again, we encourage our clients, I work with them to get them to a place where they can have a more honest relationship with a parent. And with time, they can start having similar conversations around what happened in your marriage, mum, dad? What was playing out when I was a child? What did I pick up unconsciously that you weren't able to resolve yourselves? Was there any infidelity? And again, I've asked these questions to my father because I got limerence. And I just wondered, again, was I replaying something from my mother or my father? And I asked them both. My mum at that time was just descending into her dementia. And she was adamant that no, she'd never done anything like that. And my dad also was adamant that he hadn't. But again, I just don't know. These questions remain unanswered. And that's okay, I can live. One of the gifts that limerence gave me was to learn to live with the not knowing. So that's a bit about transgenerational trauma. It's my lived experience of it, and I see it in many, if not all, of the clients that I work with. And so my question to you is, what might you be carrying in your own family line? Because we're all traumatized at some level. I forgot to mention at the beginning the main reason why I made this video, and that was the connection between transgenerational trauma and limerence. And you may be wondering, well, what is the connection? Well, I wanted to use it as an example to highlight what happens unconsciously. I've been mindful with limerence that limerence is about me, it's about us. It has nothing to do with our limerent objects. They're just reflections, mirrors, guides to open us up. And I've always been very mindful about never revealing any details about my limerent object because they're not relevant. However, there is a detail here that I believe is relevant. And that is that my limerent object is Jewish. And for me, I was never attracted to Jewish girls. I didn't marry a Jewish woman. Ruth isn't Jewish. And in my belief system, being Jewish is going to get you killed. So why would I want to identify with something that's going to get me killed? So I've always had this ambivalence towards my religion. Now, with the work I've done in therapy, I came to a realization that so much of my limerence, or a significant part, obviously it's a complex puzzle, but a significant part was unconsciously I was trying to get my dad's love and approval because he's never given me that. In that maybe if I fell in love with a Jewish woman, perhaps at last he would approve of me. Because he's said to me more than once how his biggest hurt in life is that his only son married somebody that wasn't Jewish. And as I've pointed out to him more than once, that my job in life is not to make up for what he lost in his life. My job in life is not to make him happy, it's to live my own life. We don't see eye to eye on that one, we never will, and that's okay. So for you, with your own journey through limerence, what might unconsciously your limerent object be telling you or showing you about your own history, or perhaps part of your ancestral history?